presenting on today, as Stephen has said, comes from a systematic overview that I was involved in conducting, which we concluded at the end of 2018, but which we've used ongoing to inform some of our thinking about what do we need to do to better support young people towards economic inclusion. And I'll be talking a little bit more about where this work has taken us in the next webinar when we talk about a holistic approach to youth economic and social inclusion on the 4th of November. And today, I just want to acknowledge the team that was involved in the study, which was also involved Ariane Delanois, Leila Patel and Murray Leibrand. So it was a joint initiative between ourselves at the CSDA and the Poverty and Inequality Initiative at CELDRU at UCT, and was funded by the Jobs Fund and Ready 3x3. And you can find this, the report for the study. There's a very, very long report and a summary report that's available on our website, uj.ac.za/CSDA. To do this study, what we did was we engaged in what is called an evidence synthesis methodology, where we looked at all of the available evidence about youth unemployment, about the drivers of youth unemployment, and then we also compiled a database of the kinds of interventions that are available to address youth unemployment. All in all, we systematically assessed just under 1,300 research papers, 376 government documents and articles, 2,759 program descriptions and evaluations, and we looked at what had happened in the youth unemployment space from 1990 through to 2017. I am aware that there's a number of new articles that have come out since then, and part of me really wants to update the study, and another part of me just thinks it was such a crazy project to undertake in the first place that I don't think I could ever go through it again. And so what we did with the study is we looked at then what are the drivers, what are the interventions, where are the gaps? And that's what I'm going to be talking through today. So just as a bit of background, this is compiled evidence that Dr. Zoheb Khan conducted for us that looks at both the labor force survey data and quarterly labor force survey data from 2000 to 2016. And it breaks down the youth unemployment rates. It's the expanded definition, so it includes discouraged work seekers. And each line is a different age group, 15 to 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 29, and 30 to 34. And those lines are tracking year by year what is the youth unemployment rate. And what you can see quite interestingly is where the red circle is this drop in youth unemployment rates in the period around 2007, 2008. And that is really exciting. What drove that was an increase, if we look at labor absorption rates, was an increase in labor absorption of young people in the labor market. So it also corresponds with a period of economic growth, and it's just prior to the global economic downturn of 2008, 2009, which had a little bit of a delayed impact in South Africa. So the take home for me from this graph is that one, demand definitely plays a role. We have to be increasing demand for jobs in our, or creating jobs in our economy if we're ever to completely crack this youth unemployment issue. But even when we did see that drop, we still saw sustained levels of youth unemployment, high levels of youth unemployment. And that suggests to me that there are still other factors that continue to keep young people locked out of the labor market. And so it's not just about creating jobs. We also need to be unlocking many of those barriers that young people face when it comes to the labor market, and we'll look at some of those. One of the questions we asked is, why do we have this continued high youth unemployment rate in South Africa? After all, we've got so much going on in the policy space and the programmatic space to address youth unemployment. It seems crazy that we have the highest youth unemployment rates in the world. And just by way of illustration, this slide gives you an overview of the number of policies that have been implemented since the early 1990s that either directly or indirectly are intended to address youth unemployment. So the light blue is the overarching theme of the policy milieu at the time. The yellow is the major growth path, the economic growth or the economic policy of the time. The green has to do with our public employment programs. Just above that is the pinky orangey. That has to do with specific youth unemployment policies, the jobs fund or unemployment policies, the jobs fund and the youth wage subsidy, which was later called the employment tax incentive. Then all of that purple is the training framework. The yellow is our Labor Relations Act. The blue is the BEE. The brown is our youth policies, and the orange is has to do with small business development and entrepreneurship. So what you can see here is a huge amount of effort and resource going into policy development that has to do either with employment generally or youth employment specifically. So one of the messages here is we don't need a new policy on this. We've got lots in place, and many of them are really good policies. But why do we sit with this continued youth unemployment rate? So as I said, what we decided to do is if we look at what are the driving factors behind youth unemployment alongside what the interventions are, can we identify opportunities and gaps? So what did we find? If I jump straight into that. This slide looks at what we call the macro level factors. What are the big economic and structural issues that were going on over this period that really impacted on youth unemployment? And there are 5 key issues that emerge. One is that South Africa was affected by the global economic downturn of the 2009-2010 period. And we know from research conducted by Cecil Mklatsheni and Vimal Ranshod that young people were worst affected during this time. They were the first to lose jobs. And we know from international evidence that young people were also the last to gain jobs back when there was economic recovery globally. We also know that the economy has shifted from one that's mainly driven by the primary and secondary sectors, those being mining and agriculture and manufacturing and industry sectors, to one with a stronger tertiary sector, so financial, business process outsourcing and other services. And jobs in the tertiary sector typically require different higher levels of skills. However, there have been significant failures of implementation in skills development and particularly in basic education that have resulted in a young workforce that is ill prepared to compete in an economy that demands these higher levels of skills, and an economy that will continue to do so in the age of the knowledge economy. There's also convincing evidence that higher levels of education lead to better chances of employment and income. So that reinforces the notion that higher levels of education are likely to lead to gains in employment, even though we are starting to see an uptick in graduate unemployment, which wasn't historically a major issue. So this educational deficit leads to a skills mismatch between what the demand is in the economy and what the supply side of the labor market delivers. And that contributes to high rates of unemployment in general and of youth unemployment in particular. Finally, at the macro level, the South African labor market is inefficient. As we'll explain when I look at the micro level factors as well, job seekers and employers rely heavily on social networks to find work and fill vacancies. And this creates inefficiencies in how employers and work seekers connect, as well as how employers assess potential employees for fit. That's partly explained by the fact that there's very little investment in employment support or intermediary services for work seekers at the national level. But there's also a popular claim that the South African labor market is inefficient because of labor market regulations, which are often characterized as being very strict. It's assumed that these regulations negatively affect hiring, in particular of young people. However, in our review of evidence, we actually don't find empirical evidence to underpin that assumption. And so our understanding of how those regulations affect employer behavior is limited. What we do know, however, is that the labor market is inefficient and relies very heavily on social networks, which young people tend not to have, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail later. So what have been our macro level policies and where are the gaps here? We talk here about 4 types of policies, one or programs: labor absorbing, labor saving, and labor creating, and then our training policies and programs. So in labor absorbing, a huge program, of course, is our public works program, our community works program, and I would also include there things like the National Youth Service and the National Rural Youth Service Corps. And what we've seen there is that if we think only about public works as a labor absorbing policy, it's been hugely successful. The public works programs regularly meet and exceed their targets, particularly for young people, and they have a large target for young people as well. And so purely from a labor absorbing point of view, these are really important programs. The question is, and I'll return to this slightly later, is how do we then use that opportunity for pathing young people onwards? If we look at labor creating policies, the industrial development zones, the evidence around the industrial development zones has been, they were intended to promote jobs in the manufacturing sector, but evidence shows that these have been woefully inadequate in creating jobs, despite very high levels of investment. And then there's the employment tax incentive, which is supposed to be a labor creating policy as well, and particularly for young people. What we see there, and there's very good evidence around the employment tax incentive, is that depending on the methodologies that are used, we see mixed effects. Some of the methodologies point to positive effects, some of the methodologies don't. There does, however, seem to be some agreement that there have been gains in small firms. So there appears to be scope for growth in the small business sector. And then we look at training policies, and there what we see is we've had implementation challenges. Our existing policies over time is grounded in a sound understanding of the nature of our labor market and the challenges of the skills mismatch. So for instance, you can see that reflected in the National Skills Development Strategy and previously in the Joint Initiative on Priority Skills Acquisition, and it's in the National Development Plan, but we haven't really seen the outcomes of that. And we don't go into detail about why that might be. That would be a whole other systematic review or overview, except to say that we haven't seen we're not seeing those working as effectively as they should be. And then in terms of looking at labor saving programs, those have been very limited. The National Treasury does run a labor saving program through and with the Department of Employment and Labor for when companies need to go into business rescue to retrain employees for other opportunities, but those tend not to benefit young people to a great extent. If we go on to the micro level, there's a number of challenges that young people face individually and within their communities that contribute to youth unemployment. And very quickly, there's the spatial mismatch that many young people live quite far outside of where the bulk of labor opportunities exist, and that drives up the costs of work seeking. That labor market inefficiency that I mentioned previously means that they have to rely on social networks, and many young people don't have the productive social networks that can connect them to the labor market. For instance, if we look at data about young people who are NEET, not in employment, education, and training, a huge proportion of them live in households where nobody is employed, which speaks to the fact that they don't have access to those bridging social capital that can connect them to the labor market. We also know that young people enter the labor market with a lack of work experience, and so they enter the labor market at the back of the labor market queue, if you want to put it that way. And related to the failures in our training education system is they enter the labor market with those low levels of skills, including in many cases low levels of basic numeracy and literacy, which are really seen as the entry-level requirement for entry-level jobs. Qualitative evidence also shows us that young people struggle with access to information and don't always know what information to trust, and therefore are often exposed to scams for when they're looking for work. And then if we look at the demand side on the micro level, there is some evidence to suggest that employers are risk averse in general. And so taking a risk on an untested employee, a young employee with no work experience, is maybe a jump too far, which is what the basis of the employment tax incentive was. So if we look then at programs that operate at the micro level, what have we got there? So we have what we call non-certificated skills training. And what we mean there is skills training that exists out of the qualifications framework. So it's not offered through universities or technical vocational education and training colleges, for instance. And if we look at those, it's very difficult to assess the impact of those skills training programs. What we do know is that there are a huge amount of these kinds of programs out there, a huge number of these programs out there. Many of them are run by CBOs and NGOs and are therefore easily accessible by young people in communities, and they offer a really important connection point for that reason. But they are very difficult to assess. One study that we conducted estimated the effects across a range. We looked at 8 different kinds of these programs, and we estimated the effects of them to be about that young people who participated in them were 11% more likely to be employed than looking at a matched sample in the QLFS data. That's not that's the best we could get in terms of a comparison. And so it's very much an estimate. But there are important program features of skills training programs that I'll come back to that do play a role. And what we do see is that these are important points at which young people connect and therefore often act as a counter to discouragement. We've also seen that they improve work search efficacy. Then there's work integrated learning. So here we're talking about learnerships, internships, apprenticeships. Excuse me. And if we look at the synthesis of evidence around work integrated learning, we do see major concerns about the quality, particularly of apprenticeships. But if we look at across the findings, we do see that young people who participate in these kinds of programs do tend to either stay on in the job or be able to move on to another job. So from that point of view, there does seem to be some success. And we think that one of the reasons for that success is that it gives an opportunity for employers and young people to test one another out. And so it reduces that risk that employers feel that we talked about in the previous slide. Then there's employment support and intermediation. And this, what we see here is, for instance, opportunities for supporting young people with their job search, in supporting employers to find the right employees, matching services, for instance, and working. So the key example is the work that the labor centers do, for instance. They have a database. They're supposed to, that database is supposed to match young people with, or people with jobs, but more facilitated employment support where there's actually work being done with the work seeker is also employment support. And what we see there is really positive effect. So for instance, there was a study where they looked at working with work seekers on reference letters, and it's a really simple, low-cost intervention, and they saw really positive effects. Similarly, in the study that I referred to earlier on non-certificated skills training, where that skills training includes components, so actually helping a young person to be interviewed by an employer and training them for potential job opportunities, young people in those programs were 28 percentage points more likely to be employed than young people who participated in programs that didn't have that component. So intermediation is crucial. It has really positive effects, and it's generally lower cost, a kind of low cost solution. And then some of you may wonder about the transport subsidy. If costs of work seeking is so high, what do we do about the transport? Would a transport subsidy work? And what we've seen there is that JPAL conducted a study on this, and they didn't see any effects on employment outcomes, but what they did see was improvements in labor market knowledge and adjustments in people's expectations around the labor market.
That's great.
If we look briefly at international evidence, what we see from a study conducted by Kluve and colleagues is that programs that integrate multiple services, so not just hard skills training, but also soft skills training and work experience, were more successful. Programs that profiled beneficiaries and worked closely with those beneficiaries, that follow up on individualized pathways, were successful, and also that we see larger effects in the longer term. So what do we need to do then to promote economic inclusion? And I'll end here. Is based on this, we know that the public employment programs are an important connection point for young people who may not be in other systems. And so can we leverage them to path young people onto other opportunities? Can we, for instance, give them credit for being in a public employment program or a youth service program that could then count positively towards, for instance, technical vocational education and training placement or university entrance at a later stage? We also, I think, can support organizations, and particularly here, NGOs and small businesses, to offer work integrated learning opportunities and to support them to career path young people out of those work integrated learning opportunities and into something more. And what I mean here by support is often offering these kinds of things is bureaucratic, and small businesses don't have the capacity to manage the bureaucratic processes that are often involved, neither do NGOs often. And especially small CBOs. So how do we make these easier to offer to young people? And then can we guide organizations about the kinds of support that young people need in the workplace in order to path them onwards? We know that when we look at the proportion of young people who are employed, up to 2/3 of those are actually employed in small businesses. So small businesses are absolutely crucial if we want to create jobs and if we want to absorb young people into the labor market. And we need to be supporting small businesses to take up opportunities like the employment tax incentive and to grow. Interestingly, there's not a lot of research on programs that support small businesses and what that means for labor creation. But what we do know from Latin America is that when small businesses are supported, the job placement effects are much bigger than investing in training programs only. The non-certificated skills training programs are crucial for young people. I think we need to recognize that. We need to invest in them and support them. And when I say invest and support, is that they're often run by under-resourced CBOs and NGOs. And to support in order to quality assure, to provide evidence about what works in programming so that programming can be improved, and opportunities to facilitate networks for articulation between different training programs. And then intermediation. Addressing the labor market inefficiencies is relatively low cost, and it has really positive effects. And so that for me is a big gap in our offerings and something that we can be doing a lot better. Finally, just to say that articulation is crucial. I think we have all the puzzle pieces in place in this country. It's about how do we connect the dots, both at a policy level and at a macro level. Why, for instance, public employment programs, exit opportunities are ad hoc. Can we formalize those so that there are articulated pathways for young people to travel? And then from a young person's point of view, young people find the system, these puzzle pieces, very difficult to put together. And that's understandable. I find them very difficult to put together. But how do we, from a young person's point of view, make it easier to use these opportunities to promote their economic inclusion?